Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today for this online panel event on Global Britain, a response to the call for home. I'm Ryan Henson. I'm the Chief Executive at the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and I'm delighted to be joined by such a fantastic lineup of panelists today. They come with a breadth of experience from across politics, civil society, think tanks, and the private sector. We've got Danny Kruger, the Conservative MP for Devizes, Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi, Executive Vice President at the African Centre for Economic Transformation, Polly Mckenzie, Chief Executive of the think tank Demos, and Dominic McVeigh, leading British entrepreneur and recently appointed non-executive director at the Overseas Development Institute. I'm going to tell you a bit about the coalition, then we'll hear some opening remarks from our panelists, and then we will open up to questions from you, our audience. As the event goes on, please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, along with your name, title, and organisation, and we will do our very best to get to all of them. The Coalition for Global Prosperity was established 2 years ago because we believe that Britain is at its very best when it acts as a force for good in the world, and that a smart and effective aid budget, leveraging British expertise and British values, really can and does transform lives across the world. This has been proven time and time again, whether it's peace building, global health security, or economic development and job creation. Our aid budget really does help to make the world a safer, healthier, and more prosperous place for all of us. Not only is it morally right to support those overseas who are worse off than we are, it is in our national interest as well. When we tackle Ebola in Sierra Leone, prevent drug trafficking in Tanzania, and train Lebanese forces to fight Daesh, we prevent disease, drugs, and extremism from landing on Britain's streets. And we meet at a critical time to be discussing foreign affairs. In September, there will be a new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And in the autumn, the government will publish details of its integrated review of foreign policy, defence, security, and international development. And of course, there will be a US election in November too. In this event today, we will look at how global Britain relates to the communities and the places that shape us. What decision makers can learn from civil society and the private sector when it comes to shaping UK foreign policy. We will also explore the role of international development and how, as we approach this autumn of decision, Britain can continue to help both save the lives of the most vulnerable and keep us healthier and safer here in the UK too. And with that, I will hand over to our first speaker, Danny Kruger MP, for your opening remarks. Danny, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan, and it's very good to join you. Shame I can't see the audience, but thanks for joining us, and pleased to do this. I mean, I'm very much looking forward to other contributions and the questions and answers, because my background is very much in domestic policy, in civil society. I ran charities for 10 or 12 years, and I've worked in policy and journalism and so on here in the UK, and I'm very much focused on how to make Britain better from within. But I voted for Brexit. I deployed the lines about global Britain in my election campaign, and I believe very much in our place in the world. But I very much looking forward to hearing how we might realise that from you all. A few thoughts from me, though, just where I'm coming from on all of this. If we think historically, Britain had a self-important, self-appointed role until the beginning of the last century, the first half of the last century, of basically trying to teach the rest of the world how to live. And it had a very explicit and deliberate, self-conscious idea of itself as having a superior form of civilization. And thinking about what our role might be now, I reckon that the whole world is in a similar sort of marketplace of lifestyles, as it were. What is the best way to organize a society? And we're in this glorious competitive market for good models of both domestic and foreign policy, which is a very, very fruitful place to be in. And while I don't think Britain has everything to teach the world, and in fact we've got a huge amount to learn, and I just think of all the challenges that we experience as a country and as a society, we get so much wrong, and we should hang our heads in shame when we think about particularly treatment of our elderly. A lot of the circumstance that children and young people find themselves in our country. And yet we do get quite a lot right. And most importantly, we have the mechanisms, as it were, the distribution mechanisms for communicating good practice to the world as and when we do get it right. And I worked at DCMS briefly, well, for a year or two, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which manages what you might call all the soft power elements of UK culture. And sorry to deploy this cliche, but there is something about British popular culture which says something really powerful about us and helps to explain our enduring position in the world, I think, which is, if you think about our music, what's so remarkable is British music has such a universal appeal, and by far, we're one of the great music exporting countries, and yet it is so distinctively British. We do not produce bland, Europop or any kind of bland pop. We produce something that's very distinctive. It's kind of, as it were, in a vernacular, and yet it has enormous global appeal. And there's something in that essential Britishness and its global nature, which I think is tells a powerful story about our country and why we should be confident about this new phase in our history. And I think back to I worked for a bit with Steve Hilton, David Cameron's advisor, Polly's old roommate in Number 10, who talked about, back in those heady days of the early Cameron years, we don't want to be the greatest country in the world, we want to be the best country. And what he meant by that is the country that people can be most proud to belong to. And again, it goes back to this idea that we are in a competition, a positive competition, not to be the greatest, the strongest, the richest, biggest, one of the biggest army, but to be a country that is truly great in the sense of a wonderful place to live. And I think in this global competition, Edmund Burke said to make people love their country ought to be lovable. Our first mission, and this brings it back to, I suppose, my role here in the panel and my interest, is in how do we make our own country somewhere lovable, somewhere that people here feel to be a happy place, and that is therefore, we have a social and domestic and economic model that is worthy of export, worthy of other countries trying to emulate something of what we do. So my real primary concern in politics is to try and, as it were, get our own house in order, and for me that really is about our communities, and my interest is in civil society and how we make places in this country that people are proud to belong to. And again, citing Burke, it starts with the little platoons. Our love of country begins with our love of home and of our communities, and from that we proceed towards the love of our country and of mankind, he said. So I think we can be global citizens if we are primarily local citizens. And I'd end with two. Well, actually, quick remark about Black Lives Matter. My simple view is that to heal very serious divisions in our country and in our culture, we need to work on the ground at a very much a community level. I'm less interested in the grand narratives around structure and systems and so on, and more concerned about how we work together. And I think that communities heal themselves by action. So I believe in creating opportunities of genuine social mixing and co-creation of a better society. And I think that's where my interest in that debate is. So my last and quick two tactical ideas, as it were, about what global Britain might look like. The first is as a global headquarters of social enterprise and innovation, philanthropy, civil society policy. And we have a great record in this space. We've developed all innovations which are now increasingly standard around the world around social investment. And I think we can and should do a lot more to use our development budget to promote innovations in the way money is used, public money is used for social good, and also maximise diaspora giving in both directions. So many Brits are now working and living abroad. I'd like to get them to be remitting money back to the hometowns they come from, many of which are really struggling. And of course, we have a great tradition of remittance to the rest of the world from immigrants who are living here. And then lastly, the army. So I represent a seat in Wiltshire, which is the home of the British Army. We have a quarter of the British Army based on Salisbury Plain, where I represent. And I'd love us going back to the Steve Hilton vision of not having the biggest army, but the best army in the world. And that means, obviously, extremely lethal. But what I mean by a good army is one that treats its people well, has the right kit, but most of all behaves in the best way possible. I think we have a tarnished tradition, but a good one as well, of an army that operates in a moral framework. And I think that would be an amazing export if people could, once again, as I think they largely do around the world, admire the British Army, not just for its power, but for its goodness. That's it from me, Ryan.
Great. Thank you very much, Danny, for your opening remarks. We'll now hear from Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi. Mavis was recently appointed as the Executive Vice President of the African Centre for Economic Transformation. And prior to this, Mavis was Director of Investments at the Power of Nutrition and sits on the boards of a number of international development NGOs. Over to you, Mavis.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon for our conversation on the importance of community in global Britain's agenda. I've had the incredible privilege of working in international development my whole life, starting in Her Majesty's government, working in civil society, and now working for an African organization. And I think as we think through the new department, as we think through how Britain's international development assistance is spent, it is really important that we don't forget the excellent work that is done on engaging communities with communities. Britain does a lot of work on community partnerships. And I just want to talk you through one example of this community partnership and how it's benefiting both communities in Britain and communities in developing countries. So DFID and the British Council currently finance something called Connecting Classrooms through Global Learning. And the program is focused on linking teachers, pupils, and communities in the UK with counterparts in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Their main objective is to train teachers and school leaders in the UK and in developing countries to equip their pupils with the knowledge and skills they require to live in a global economy. Now, through this program, Nelson Primary School in East Ham, London, is twinned with St. Joseph's School in Kisumu, Kenya. And the program is flexible, so long as the schools and the teachers and the communities are working within the SDGs, which are very broad, as you all know, they can pick topics that they work on together around this agenda. So these two schools have a number of issues they are working on, and one of the issues they've picked is climate action. And as part of their climate action, the children in Nelson School are learning the impact of plastics on people around the world. So they know and they read, they learn at school and they learn within their communities on the negative impact of plastic. But they don't necessarily always see that impact on their doorsteps. But their friends in St. Joseph's are sharing with them the impact of plastics in Lake Victoria and how it's affecting their parents' ability to fish, their income levels, and explaining to them that if we don't get this right, that plastic could be on your doorstep, Britain as an island very soon. And it could start to affect your households and your livelihoods, etc. So the two schools are now running a recycling program, and it's really exciting. It's not just recycling in East Ham, it's recycling in East Ham and also recycling in St. Joseph's in Kisumu. And the children at Nelson's are not just recycling what Newham can recycle in plastic. They've gone the extra mile and partnered with a local NGO in Newham, and they're recycling things like pens and toothbrushes, etc., that Newham Council does not recycle. And the income that is being made is being used to support their friends in Kisumu and to improve their own environment within East Ham. But it's a program that both sides benefit from. So the teachers were telling me that they are also learning from each other. So for example, the teachers in St. Joseph's are adapting their pedagogy to really achieve better teaching outcomes. So for example, in St. Joseph's, they are learning about being more aware of how they embed issues within the community in their teaching styles, to adopt more lateral thinking teaching styles, so that they can use whatever they have around them to teach with limited teaching aids. The teachers in Nelson Primary were really surprised by how confident the students in St. Joseph's were. And we're keen to understand, how do we build the confidence of students in Nelson who have less confidence, especially our female pupils? And they discovered two things. One was poetry. The students at St. Joseph are encouraged to learn and recite poetry and share it across the class, and that's how they've built confidence. So now Nelson has a poetry club, and it's really having a positive impact on building the confidence of young girls in Nelson Primary, who are now more engaged in other activities in a way that they haven't been before. And also teachers in Nelson have learned that they have terrible handwriting, so do their pupils, because everything is done on computers. However, whenever they receive information from St. Joseph's, it's beautifully written. So they are now encouraging their students to improve their handwriting with something called the Nelson Handwriting Standard. So what I wanted to share through this example is communities adapt, improve, but communities also learn from each other. And it doesn't matter whether you are a community in East Ham linking up to a community in, I don't know, somewhere in Scotland. You can learn as much, a school and a community in East Ham can learn as much from a school and community in Kisumu. And this is something that development assistance in the UK has facilitated. And we need to do more of that and ensure we don't lose that opportunity. But the thing that really struck me when I was talking to the colleagues in this is how both schools are benefiting in learning outcomes. So in Kenya, every school wants a large percentage of their pupils to end up in what they call top tier schools. Prior to this partnership, Nelson was sending maybe 1 or 2 students to top tier schools. This year, they sent 48 out of 66 students to top tier schools. Sorry, St. Joseph's, my apologies. Nelson has really seen an improvement, as I said, in the confidence of its pupils. They've really seen a much more engagement from their pupils and their families and their communities. And this year, Nelson School in East Ham was a mayor school, received an award from the London mayor for a school of excellence. So as we talk about what is going to come out of the new department, what is going to come out of these reviews, it is really critical that we don't get lost in thinking through national agendas, national partnerships, and we don't lose this critical opportunity of community to community engagement. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Mavis, and thank you for that challenge to us as well. Right, our next guest speaker is Polly Mckenzie. Polly leads the leading cross-party think tank Demos and sits on the board of the Big Ten Ideas Festival and has also served in very senior level sort of government, as Danny alluded to earlier on. Polly, over to you.
So I'm a bit nervous because I don't know what global Britain means. And I think it's worth us taking a pause to try and figure that out before we start landing on some of these kind of quite micro, though vitally important and inspiring kind of policy specifics. It's one of the very few things that Theresa May and Boris Johnson have both talked about. And for it to survive that transition, it must be big and important. And yet I still don't know what it means. It first emerged really as this Theresa May said that Brexit had been a vote for global Britain. And I remember reading that, hearing that, and going, what are you talking about? No, it's not. And of the last 3 years, 4 years have mostly been an eternal debate about what the Brexit vote really meant. And I don't want to go into that. But it's clear that there is more than one reason for voting for Brexit. And there is a group of people for whom a kind of international libertarian free trader group, and Brian's mentioned the Big Tent Festival. There was George Freeman ran a competition for the best policy once, and I was very upset because I lost to a guy from the Institute for Economic Affairs who stood up and advocated for unilateral free trade, the abolition of corporation tax, and basically open borders for so that there would be no barriers to migration. And it's a coherent political philosophy around total openness, a kind of globalized libertarianism. And there are some people who voted for Brexit because for them the EU was a protectionist bloc, which of course it is from many perspectives in lots of ways. And what they wanted was less of that kind of thing. And that's one version of what global Britain is, that some people who love that stuff are in fact Conservative Party donors, or more likely donors to the Institute for Economic Affairs. And I don't begrudge their position, I just think that they're wrong. And it's clear that a plurality of those who voted for Brexit wanted something different. They wanted a less global Britain. And again, that's fine. I personally quite like the European Union, but it's perfectly reasonable for people to want something different, for us to have more controls, more borders, more restrictions, more protection for industries like the steel industry against the kind of vagaries of that neoliberal globalized economy that had been the sort of predominant set of economic thinking from not just UK leaders, but also kind of Thatcher, Reaganism, and the Washington Consensus around development as well. So people said that they wanted something different. And of course, what's extraordinary and impressive about the Brexit coalition is that it managed to bring these two quite different tribes of people with quite different wishes for what should happen together under the banner that we should leave the European Union. And they won, and great. So here we are, saying that we're going to implement global Britain on behalf of people who it's not clear to me that they wanted it. In fact, there's a lot of people, including a former Department for International Development Secretary, Priti Patel, who really quite skeptical about the value of UK aid. There's a reasons why CGP exists is because there is a counter movement within the Conservative Party and in other parts of our politics as well. It's not just a Conservative issue, who have a deep, profound skepticism about whether we should really do any of this international aid stuff, and certainly whether we should have stayed committed to the 0.7%. It was extremely controversial. It was extremely difficult to get that through Parliament. So is global Britain about us selling things to the world, in which case, great, fine. The problem is that sometimes when you want to sell things to the world also wants to sell you its things. And of course, there are plenty of farmers or steel manufacturers who might have a problem with that. Is it about saving the world or being the world's policeman? In a way that the New Labour government advocated for. And I remember when we talked about doctrines of interventionism and trying to decide when it was okay and whether it was right to step in the Balkans, or whether we should have acted earlier within Rwanda, or and all of that debate about whether we should go around trying to be the world's peacekeepers seems to have evaporated, potentially, understandably, under a view that we tried extensively and it didn't work, even when it was done with the best of intentions. So we're not probably, I think majority of public opinion is really deeply skeptical about us going around trying to save the world. Aid, I think one of the things that CGP does very effectively is make a case for aid which is based only partly on compassion, but is also based around a kind of enlightened self-interest. The sense that by building up economies around the world, we can create markets for ourselves. There's some relationship to the kind of Washington Consensus doctrines. Or that by building up economies in the world, we might be able to stop all those pesky foreigners wanting to come to the UK. That's a narrative that's used. Or by building up economies around the world, we might stop people wanting to kill us quite so often. Or we might be able to reduce the risks of domestic terrorism by undermining some of those really damaging narratives that suggest that the UK just doesn't give a damn when Muslims are persecuted around the world. And certainly it's good to see our government starting to be a bit more serious about the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in China. So I guess this is not a very structured set of thoughts, because I worry about what we've chosen here, what it is that we want. I'm waiting to see a view taken by the huge number of thoughtful and intelligent people, both within the Conservative Party broadly and around the Prime Minister, on what they really, what they mean by global Britain. And if it does come down to just a sort of slightly thin view that we'd like other people to buy our pork pies, well, great. I think I might start to campaign for some other things. But they have been skeptical about aid. They have been skeptical about the kind of trade that involves opening up our borders. And they have been skeptical about the kind of approach to immigration that recognizes if we want to send people and services to other countries, they might want to send people and services to ours. Perhaps I'm missing something, but it seems to me that the convenience of glossing over some of these genuine trade-offs and complexities for the sake of Brexit has been left to the point where it's kind of festering. And I would love to see a speech by a foreign secretary or a foreign and development office secretary that suggested they had a grasp of some of the complexity of foreign affairs that exceeds my own, which is, I recognise, pretty limited.
Thank you so much, Polly, for those opening remarks, and we really look forward to getting stuck into some of the questions that you've posed during the course of this discussion. We'll now hear from our final speaker, Dominic McVeigh. Dominic is a global ethical business leader who's founded a number of successful businesses trading across Africa and Asia. Over to you, Dominic.
Thank you, Ryan. It's always useful to go last because I get a sentiment of the views, the concerns, and it helps give me a better picture to be as productive as possible for the audience and other panelists. I've spent the last 7 or 8 years operating, building and creating businesses, as you mentioned, across predominantly East Africa, Kenya and Ethiopia, as well as Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and also Central America, places like Mexico, where in Sonora, very challenging environments. But over that period was able to create in excess of 15,000 jobs, over 5,000 jobs in Kenya in less than 12 months, ethical jobs, jobs where the staff, my colleagues were treated as well as one would want to be treated themselves, childcare facilities, sexual health services. Recently won an award for the most inclusive employer in Ethiopia, where disability is a major factor. So not just building businesses at the lowest cost and going for the lowest cost, building the best businesses, the best of British, the best of product, and making sure that people are treated the best way possible. And that, many people see that as a challenging task. For us, for me, it was the only task to be done, to make sure people were treated with integrity and that doing good is good business, which is something I'll come on to. But in that period, over $200 million a year was created in revenue for these countries. And the only reason we were able to develop in these challenging regions was because of the investment of the likes of the British government. To trade in Kenya, the cost per mile several years ago was extremely high. The amount of time it took to clear goods in Mombasa port was several days. Cross-border trade was near on impossible. Standardizations across the region was a challenge. And when I turned up in Nairobi and was set up in what was called an economic prosperity zone in a region called Athi River, about 30 miles outside of the center of Nairobi, our access to trade, our access to logistics, our cost per mile, the speed of which we could move had dramatically increased. The positive impact by British investment into organisations such as Trademark East Africa made it possible to do business. Had I turned up in Kenya 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to do business. It would have taken too long to get goods in, too long to get goods out, and it would have cost a fortune. It wouldn't have been possible. British businesses have been able to succeed internationally by the investments, not of DIT or the Foreign Office, but by investments of DFID, an international aid organisation spending ODA money. And there's some irony in that, because a lot of people see DFID as an organisation for humanitarian response. But the truth is, in my example, DFID's investment enabled me to do business. And that enabled Britain to export its services, its skills, and not just ship back to the UK, but under AGOA, under other trade deals that Kenya and Ethiopia have, we are able to ship duty-free to countries such as China, Australia, Canada, the US, Mexico, as well as Europe and the UK. So our access to markets by the investment of the British government into Kenya was far greater than my access to markets from the UK. And once again, not a DIT investment or FCO investment. This was a DFID investment. This wasn't a humanitarian program. This was a program to get British businesses, the cogs oiled and organisations happening. But I do as well agree with Danny's comments about there is work to be done here in Britain. There is work to be done at home. You know, it is appalling that British Somalis are sending their children to school in Somaliland because it's safer. You know, well-documented examples of this. It's appalling that there are still almost 1 million people having to rely on food banks. And let me give you some context to this on how this impacts the developing world. If people are still having to go to food banks for assistance in the UK, people will continue to buy a t-shirt for £1. If people continue to buy a t-shirt for £1, brands will have to find suppliers that will cut corners, not pay a fair wage, damage environment and community, so that someone in the UK that can't afford to shop with an ethical brand or producer is being forced to shop in a retail environment which does not support the developing world. So it is interlinked. The only way to overcome poverty in the developing world, in my mind, is that we have to overcome poverty in the developed world. But we can't just make Britain a nicer and better place to live, because we can't export sentiment. We also actually don't have a lot to export. Most of what we export is very little in terms of physical products. And what we do export, the raw materials are probably being imported by countries, from countries such as China, India, Kenya, Ghana. Yeah, let's be frank, we are facing shortage of food on the shelves in the UK. And if it wasn't for DFID, we wouldn't be having food on our shelves to the extent that we have currently. We are reliant as an island on major imports. If we want to deal better with countries internationally, we have to think about how we make those investments. And with the change with the FCO and DFID becoming under one roof and DIT potentially getting access to ODA, this is now an opportunity to actually say, right, where are we weak? What can we and can we not produce? What countries do we need to support to make sure that our long-term goals are supported, but at the same time support the long-term goals of our countries and partners that we want to work with? Because the idea of it's global Britain, we're going to sell to the world, sorry guys, it doesn't exist, because we import most of what we have to sell back out to the world. And most of what we export back out has very little value for the British economy. Apart from services such as lawyers and architecture, what are we actually shipping when we're building an airport in Addis, for example? We might be shipping some aeroplane wings to, Airbus in Toulouse to be assembled onto, but those raw materials where the real value is coming from elsewhere. So there is a role to be played with a British vision and ODA money to make sure Britain does have a global standing and a responsible standing. And I just wanted to come on to some points that Polly made. Selling things to the world, we've touched upon that, but what are we selling? Saving the world? Well, I don't think Britain can save the world on its own. And actually, as we've seen through the COVID pandemic, to save the world needs to come together. And globalization is not a bad thing. It's a very good thing. Peacekeepers, well, as Danny mentioned, our armed forces are not strong enough to go around the world keeping peace. Where are you going to send that one aircraft carrier when we have peace missions all over the world that need dealing with? And the narratives, I really feel the narratives are defunct. we shouldn't be saying, let's invest in Ghana because we want to reduce legal or illegal immigration. We need to be embracing with countries, and let's just face the facts. Whether a country is doing well or not, there is immigration. How many people from France do we have in the UK, right? Probably almost 1 million. They're not coming here because things are bad in France. They're coming here for opportunities and prosperity. So the idea of making Kenya and Ghana better is going to reduce immigration. We need to move away from that. We need to be pro-immigration and understand the reasons for people moving around. But that shouldn't, so we shouldn't be invested in countries because we don't want their fellow countrymen to not come and women to come here. I mean, it's not bonkers. EU protectionism, I think that's a really good point to make. The EU did become protectionist and it made it very hard to trade with other countries. And that's why I started investing in countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, who have trade deals with the world, not just a few that they pick. And, you know, let's also think about Amazon, right? This company, the share price went up 8% yesterday. It's just guns blazing. And we see this as a threat to the high street, but actually it's not just a threat to the high street. It's a threat to so many of us, but it also has so many positives. The positives is it sells huge amounts of product to the UK consumers. But where is that product coming from? And what influence or what corporation tax, what businesses are generating that product to pay a tax back in the UK? Very few to none. So we're not just having to challenge Amazon here. Yeah, let's look at countries of origins of goods. Let's make sure the countries of origins are countries that we want to work with, countries we want to develop, countries that we can stabilize. But, you know, back to Danny's point, if we've got factories in Leicester where people are being abused, how can we go to Ethiopia and tell them how to run their factories? Yeah, there is still a lot of work for this government to do. But whilst we can do good and should do good, and whilst businesses must deliver on their ethics and their promises to support community and planet, we must hold them to account, because doing good is good for Britain and good business is good for the world. So this needs to be interlinked you know, we need to transform the mindsets. We don't need new legislation. The Modern Slavery Act is there. The legislation is there to be enforced. There may be legislation that needs to be tweaked through time, but we have a lot here to make Britain a better place, to show the world that we can do things well. And then we can start to export sentiment. But until then, we need to start exporting our investments into people, into planet, into community, and understanding how that pays back to the British people and how the British people can pay it back to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you very much for another excellent set of opening remarks, and thank you to all our panel for helping to frame the discussion, which I'm sure will follow now. For those watching, please keep putting your questions into the Q&A, and we'll do our very best to get to them. Before we do, let's start by unpicking the challenge Polly put to us a few minutes ago about what global Britain is. Danny, you voted Leave. You're in government at various stages over the past few years. What does global Britain mean to you? Is it a sort of slogan that's yet to be filled in, or does it have real substance? And if not, what should be there?
Well, I voted for Brexit for the reasons that Polly was referring to, the opposite ones from global Britain, if we're making that distinction, which I actually do want to challenge the distinction. But yes, I mean, I think the title of your seminar is taken from my maiden speech. I said that Brexit was a response to the call of home. I think that people were voting because they want to have a sense of agency. They want to take back control of the destiny of their communities. And our national community is a sort of proxy, really, I think, for what people really want, which is the places they live in, which are local places, should be better, and that they themselves have some role in what happens locally. So I think there's a great sort of disempowerment that has occurred over many years and for many reasons, of which the EU became a sort of ultimate representative. But that's not to say that the idea of global Britain is a bad one. And I was trying to work out what Polly's difficulty was, because I mean, I think she does get what global Britain is. She just doesn't like it. She was basically saying she objects to the notion of a free trading, outward-looking, really competitive Britain, and I mean, I honour that because partly I share it, and I'm a localist more than a globalist. But there's a direct connection with it, and I think Dominic made some very powerful points about the connection. And what I think global Britain is a communication from the government that in leaving the EU, the UK is not retreating within our borders. We are going to remain an engaged global player, and we have greater opportunities to be a good global citizen outside the EU. I mean, there are downsides to leaving the EU in terms of not being in conversations that the EU has. There are upsides too, including notably being able to have an immigration system that better serves our global relationships rather than just our European ones. So I think that Global Britain means a positive, outward-looking, generous attitude to the world. I hope not a Little England one, or a kind of macho imperialistic one, but as I said, one that promotes the great sort of cultural connections that the UK has internationally, and enables us to be a good citizen in this new century, which is one of interconnectedness and globalization. It's about playing our role in that.
Thanks, Danny. Mavis, what does Global Britain mean to you, or what should it mean?
So I never feel comfortable about sitting at polar ends. I just think the world is too complex for us to sit at polar ends. For me, it's about, I like to call it glocal. Whether Britain likes it or not, the world is so interconnected. And I think, Dominic, your presentation gave an excellent outline of the interconnectivity of the world. But that global interconnectivity doesn't have to happen at the expense of the local. And I think we need to respect the local. I'm not a big believer necessarily on global. There was a term that was floating around a few years ago, glocal. We need to recognize the importance of the local within that global structure. And wherever you go, communities are coming together in a much more interlinked way than we probably saw in the 80s and 90s. Communities really work together and recognize the importance of their interdependence. But there's also a recognition that that interdependence does not sit in a little village in X. That interdependence is linked to your county and your country and the rest of the world. How do we make local work in practice for Britain? For me, is the question. I don't think it has to be one or the other. It's not polar opposites.
Thank you, Mavis. Polly, you posed the question, what does it mean to you? And if I can ask as well, as an extension of that, Demos is a cross-party think tank. Is there anything that broadly society can agree on when it comes to Global Britain? And is international development, or could international development be one of them?
So I think Danny's challenge is a fair one. Perhaps I wasn't clear. I guess what I'm struggling to do is reconcile a set of free trading aspirations that one might easily associate with Global Britain with the explicit policy mandate that the government has set out, both in its manifesto and elsewhere, which seems to be about retreat. And I think they continue to say all the different things because they can, and maybe that the schism and the problems associated with the fact that actually a lot of their mandate, including in this kind of red wall area, comes from people who don't want to face the demands of the free market. And maybe they're right to do so. I think I'm probably actually in the end more of a free trader than Danny is, but it's the liberal tendencies. What do I think? I think there could be a lot of consensus. I think CGP does a really great job at talking, as I said, about the enlightened self-interest, finding new frames, new language to explain the value of both giving aid and forging connections in the way that Mavis was talking about between us and our fellow humans in far-flung parts of the world to all of our. There's no question, but I think it would require a government that was ready, and I look forward to this happening. I'd be delighted if it did, really showing leadership about the value of aid and the value of international development, which perhaps is a more comfortable language, because as Dominic was saying, that actually a lot of the interventions that we have done in the past and will continue rightly to do are about enabling economies to grow and businesses to thrive. And absolutely, that's what people in the developing world want, rather than a simple aid relationship. But but whilst we continue to hear mostly narratives about I guess about how it's all wasteful and it's, oh, we should look after ourselves before we look after other people. I worry that those are narratives which are supported by and encouraged by both the government's friends in the press and also by a certain part of their political hinterlands, that I would rather that they challenged to build a consensus. I think consensus doesn't happen by accident. It requires real effort, and I would like to see that.
Thank you. Dominic, what does Global Britain mean to you? And you're a businessman. I mean, you see the sort of economic case for the sort of Britain acting as a force for good in the world. You could argue that you've contributed to that. But what does it how do we change that narrative, and how do we make the case for Britain doing the right thing because it's the right thing and not just because it's in our self-interest?
I think ultimately the British are a compassionate, Britain is a very compassionate country. British people are compassionate. We have empathy. I think we have emotional intelligence. I'd like to think we do. And I think it's certain that we all want the best for others. And we talk about the little village mentality, but let's be honest, a lot of people my parents live in a little village. They're from East London. I come from a multicultural family. Little villages have changed unless you've been out to one. And it's probably people like my mum that's given the money to the donkey charities and the starving kids in Yemen through those adverts, actually. And I'm not fully familiar with views, but even my mum was pro-Brexit and my dad was anti-Brexit, but one of them was on one side and one was the other, and they continue to give to help the world. And these ultimately, British people don't want to see others suffering. It's in our nature. We saw on the VE Day celebrations, we've come together as a country. There are still a number of divisions that we need to work through, and that has to happen through community. But I have confidence in the FCO and DFID merger. And I have confidence that the FCO will be, the FCDA will be working towards driving British policy into the right countries and making sure Britain invests to show that commitment. And those commitments, I'm confident, will be strong. They'll be well balanced. They will be balanced for the British interests. And I'm also confident that the projects that they invest in, I suspect and I hope that they will manage more directly. So, landmine action, remnants of British weapons in conflict zones. Do we give the money to the UN to deal with it, to then farm it back out to a UK charity? Or do we actually work directly with a UK charity to deal with the remnants of wars? And I suspect the FCO will be wanting to make sure it can get countries back on track and working directly with organisations to get countries back on track. Not to suggest that funds should not be going to the UN, but where we have such a well-developed charity network in the UK and charities operating internationally, I would like to think it makes sense to deal with British charities directly as opposed to through New York or Geneva and back to the UK and the wastage of funds. So I think we may be able to get better spending. I know there are concerns of cuts, but those cuts are not coming because the 0.7% has changed. Those cuts are coming because our economy has shrunk. And we have a new department which is faced with that challenge and is going to have to make money go further. So those things will be considered. But how do we get British people to reflect their sentiment and goodwill to the rest of the world? Well, if you're in business, the fact is the British market is only so big, right? There's 65 million of us here. And, if we're selling 100 million bottles of mayonnaise a year, I don't think the British people are going to double down on mayonnaise. So you've got to go selling mayonnaise elsewhere. And if the British government wants those British businesses that make mayonnaise to sell a lot more mayonnaise and it can't sell it to British people, it's going to have to help us sell mayonnaise to people in other countries. And if it's going to be developing countries, well, Britain's going to have to help those countries develop, because I can't afford to build roads and airports and ports and I can't export all the services. So this is where it needs to become interlinked, where the FCO can invest in countries to make British business more prosperous, get us better access to markets, also get its product back into the UK, and tax back into the Treasury, back into the FCO. The money has to come back to keep going around, to keep going back out. So I'm confident we will be positive in that response, and the FCO will understand it has to support businesses in overseas countries if we're going to make a difference in those countries, because I can't do it on my own.
Thank you, Dominic. Right, we'll take questions now from our audience. We've got one from Sarah Champion, Labour MP for Rotherham and Chair of the International Development Select Committee. And Sarah's question is, do you think the merger of DFID and the FCO will help or hinder our global standing? And do you support the International Development Select Committee changing its remit to be able to give parliamentary oversight and scrutiny to how aid money is spent across Whitehall? Polly, can I come to you first with that? Do you think that the merger of the two departments will alter, hinder or help Britain's global standing?
I think it's a really sad day, and I don't think it helps. I think there isn't, as I said, a really clear narrative about what we want from the world, and a tendency to assume that the world exists to serve us. And I think that's more of a concern. I think it's absolutely right, as Sarah suggests, that the committee should expand its remit. I think select committees, which are, you know, one of the very few high functioning parts of our parliament, should have such an essential role to play in our constitution. We published a paper by Andrew Tyree earlier in the year about how we could strengthen the roles and powers of select committees, including compelling witnesses and giving them sort of quasi-judicial role. And I would commend article by Andrew to your viewers. But I think, of course, Sarah, you should absolutely do that.
Danny, can I come to you next on that one?
Yeah, I mean, really quickly, glad to hear Sarah's on this. She should be on the panel. Got a lot to contribute here. I mean, yes, I think it was the right thing to do. I think the original carving out of the ODA from Foreign Office in the 90s was a sort of kind of throwback to a 20th century geopolitical situation when foreign policy was largely about containing the Eastern Bloc, and development happened independently of it. Whereas now, for reasons Dominic's been saying, foreign policy, diplomacy, and development are inextricably linked, as a defence policy. So I think the need for integration is very real, and no doubt we'll also make some savings and efficiencies this way. So I'm in favour of it, but I do, and you know, reflecting Polly's, I think, legitimate sort of confusion about global Britain. Ultimately, the structures don't matter as much as the culture that inhabits the structures, and what we need is to be a good country. And then, you know, the mechanisms in the Whitehall furniture will serve their purpose no matter how things are organised. So I mean, I want us to have the right foreign policy, the right posture in the world. But if the development secretary sits in the Foreign Office, I'm less bothered, and I think it's, for reason Dominic's been giving, it's probably the right one.
Thanks, Danny. Mavis, if my memory serves me correctly from our previous conversation we've had, you served at DFID as an official. Do you think this merger hinders or helps Britain's role on the world stage?
So it's interesting. At the country level, the perception of a merger has been happening for a number of years, with DFID offices moving into the Foreign Office from separate offices when I first joined DFID. But I think I am less worried at this moment about form and more concerned about function. I think we need to expend a lot more energy thinking about what the new department will focus on. What will it deliver? What will its culture be? If the new department's culture, it's a traditional Foreign Office culture that subsumes DFID, then yes, it will hinder our global standing. If the new department's culture is a culture about really looking at how we deliver development assistance in a robust way and how we work in partnership with countries, then it's simply a new structure. And it's, you know, as an ex-DFID, well-trained, I went straight to DFID from university, so I am a well-trained ex-DFIDite, to say that it's for me, it's less about the form. I think I feel that debate has moved on. We need to now really focus on the function of the new department, and we need to be very careful that that function is about partnership. And I think, as everybody has said, we can define global Britain as we want. The world has moved on. It's moved on so drastically. People like me represent what Britain is today. We belong in a global world. I'm not going anywhere. Neither are a lot of other people. So it's about the function of that department. And Sarah, yes, I fundamentally believe that it has to have scrutiny of ODA across all departments. One of the things that made DFID what it was in its new incarnation post 1997 was the scrutiny that Parliament and other organizations had over it around quality, accountability. And if that is removed from the broader ODA, then yes, it will hinder our global standing.
Thank you, Mavis. Dominic, if I may, because you worked closely with Department for International Trade, Business Department, and so on and so forth, do you think, first of all, what are your thoughts on the merger, but also how do we best ensure that ODA money is spent as effectively as possible, and just how does that sort of play into the sort of mechanisms Parliament enacts going forwards? You know, whether we keep the ICI subcommittee, whether we have a separate select committee to monitor aid spend. What are your thoughts on those?
First of all, I think the merger gives us huge opportunity to reflect on what we've done wrong and what we've done right. I would like the well-respected individuals at the FCO, though, to hear a statement I've always made. Those that work at DFID are heroes. They've saved lives, they've created businesses, they've created jobs, and they've made a difference in some of the most difficult parts of the world, and they need to be treated with that respect as it merges in. They are heroes to me, and they're heroes to the countries that they operate in. But now we have the opportunity to combine foreign policy with ODA. For once, the Foreign Office, or let's call it, we have to call it the FCDA, it's not the Foreign Office anymore, it'll be the FCDA, has a checkbook, and it can actually start to put some money behind its policies, put some money where its mouth is, and support countries where it means it. Because in the past, it's been, I suspect, been very difficult. The Foreign Office has been trying to support a country and DFID's not there, for example, and the money's not there. So they have to go to the DIT to try and get businesses to invest, and the businesses say, like I would say, where's the roads and the ports? Where's the technical skills? Where's the capacity training? There's landmines everywhere. How do you expect me to do business here and support this country? So as long as the FCO can grasp the fact that we can't just turn up and do business and generate income to pay tax back in the UK, and understands that ODA has to be invested to make business possible, I think that the opportunities are now going to be endless, subject to budgets, of course. But we should be able to align far better the strategy of the Foreign Office and the investment that the FCDA can now make, and make sure that it understands how businesses work. And everyone in DFID, and you know, Mavis touched upon it as well, doesn't want to be there saving people. It wants to be there creating prosperity for people. Unfortunately, at times we do have to save people, and it is in our interest to save people wherever, whenever we can in the world. But ultimately, the goal that DFID has always had is to create prosperity. And to create prosperity, we have to create jobs. And those jobs don't have to come at the expense of Britain. In fact, they come at the benefit of Britain. If we can support British companies to invest in West Africa, for example, those British companies will create jobs, they will stabilise those economies, and those British companies will create product that can be exported to across the continent, around the world, back to Britain, and revenues come back to the UK and taxes paid back in, and also taxes are paid in the countries they work in, and hopefully we can pass down the skills and the knowledge, and those countries can build the businesses themselves as well and begin to trade. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. There's so much to be thought through. I'm not in politics, so I can't comment on select committees and oversights, but one thing I know, in a business of 15,000 people, you need to make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing T's and knowing what the hell's going on, and make sure you get value for money. DFID knows how to spend money on projects. FCO hasn't had these budgets in the past, and that's really something that needs to be thought about, making sure those skill sets are not lost and that they come over, and they come over effectively and with good morale. There's no point doing this merger if there's going to be internalized division or the sentiment is not positive, because it's going to be a challenge for ministers. The Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, is going to get undermined at every turn he makes, and it will not be a success, and that is not good for Britain. It's not good for any of the heroes that we have in the FCDA now. I hope that gives some political insight for someone that's not into politics, I'm afraid.
That's great, Dominic. It's good to get the perspective of someone who's not perhaps following it as closely as others are. Mavis, did you want to come in?
No, it's just, as Dominic was speaking, it just occurred to me that we often forget that when we talk about British businesses and we talk about British investment, a lot of them are second generation diaspora, British second generation diaspora, who have the same vested interest in Britain as and in Kenya or Ghana or wherever it might be, as Dominic has in Kenya or Ghana, where his investment is, and in London, where his home is. It works for both. So we should just remember that Britain in 2020 and beyond looks a bit like this minor plus Asia. And we've just got to acknowledge that.
It's very true.
And we needed one more woman to balance it out, I think, Polly.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mavis. My next question touches on something that's been in the news a fair bit over the past few weeks. And my question is, if we're beginning to see values compete more with traditional factors, such as, I suppose, the raw national interest when it comes to diplomacy, and I'm thinking particularly around the decision to remove Huawei, which is estimated to cost a small fortune, and yet it's seen as the right thing to do, and therefore a price worth paying. Where else do we think there's space in UK foreign policy to, or for the right thing, if you like, to trump the traditional way of doing things? Polly, perhaps I can come to you first.
I guess the challenge is not finding right things to do, it's finding right things where you can actually make a difference. If you think about any number of the conflict interventions that the UK has made, where the case for doing it has been mixed, but the desire has not been a kind of like proto-colonialist view that we'd like to just take over Iraq. It's a question about how, and it's one of the reasons why back in the day Claire Short was one of the people advocating for the invasion of Iraq, was because she saw as International Development Secretary, the suffering and the oppression of the people within Iraq. The problem is that to wish it were so is a hell of a lot easier than making it so. And I mentioned the Uyghurs in northern China. It would be nice to feel that there was something we could do, and there is certainly more that can be done, where we see the extraordinary kind of disregard of human rights by countries to whom the kind of international rules-based order is of no interest or value. The problem is that when those countries are very large and very powerful and our economies are interdependent, it becomes a balanced judgment as to whether you can contribute much. I think Huawei is interesting, really, is that if you look into the details of the judgment is about actually how much under the thumb of the Americans are. The Americans have made a decision to develop a trade war with China, rightly or wrongly. I would have rather we'd taken a more aggressive role on China and human rights for a long time. Nevertheless, we are now in a situation where we made a decision in our national interest to include Huawei in our 5G network. And that was then changed basically because the view of the intelligence security, the intelligence and security services was that they couldn't scrutinize the products because the Americans wouldn't let them get their hands on them. And that actually suggests that we are incredibly powerless to really take decisions in our own interest and make them independently. That's not an answer to your question either, though. But I think it's why so many in the end of our prime ministers end up torching their political careers on the altar of bad foreign policy, is because you get to the role of prime minister and you feel like you ought to have the power to do things and fix things. And you look at the problems of the world and you imagine that because you're the prime minister and you reach the pinnacle of your political career, you ought to be able to fix them. And I think we probably need a lot more humility in our foreign policy if we're to be successful. Sorry, that's really not an answer to your question, but it's what I think.
No, that's great, thank you. It's a difficult question. Danny, can I come to you next on this? Do you think that you know, the sort of actions of the Foreign Secretary in putting human rights at the top of the agenda is a sign that we're heading in the right direction? And could international development be somewhere where we do what we believe is the right thing to do, and not necessarily because it's in our economic self-interest always?
Yes, I mean, these are the sort of questions that can only be answered in practice. I mean, we can only generalise about getting the balance right. I'm not sure it's the case that historically Britain has been sort of amoral and self-interested in all its foreign engagements. But I'm glad that the Foreign Secretary has made this commitment. The government's made this commitment on Huawei. I'm glad we're doing what we're doing in Hong Kong. I'm glad there's the new focus on the Uyghur Muslims. So I respect and support my colleagues on the Conservative backbenches who are pushing for a more robust, or at least kind of strategic and long-term and clear-eyed view of China. So I support that trend. I recognise that you can't. We've only got so much power, which isn't significant. We can't stop. If they invade Hong Kong, we can't do anything about it. But we do have some leverage, and we should be using it, I think, as well as we are. I just try and answer your question a bit differently, or rather the way Polly put it, which is, what can we do? What areas can we actually exercise leverage in the world to make the world better? And one area, and again, it's Brexit related, is in agricultural policy and in trade policy, both of which we now have control over. And what we have the opportunity to do here, we have a very difficult choice to make about whether we pursue even cheaper food on our shelves, or whether we protect our domestic standards. And my preference is very much for the latter choice. But that isn't just about protecting our farmers. In fact, we shouldn't be doing it for that reason. Much as I want to protect my Wiltshire farmers, this is the right thing to do globally. We are this enormous market. Great big new market has opened up for the world's food producers. The UK now running its own trade policy, food trade policy. And what we should be doing with that is doing deals around the world that enhance global food and animal welfare standards. And if people want to sell food into our market, they need to produce food at standards that are acceptable to our consumers. So we should be quite assertive in that regard, and quite sort of taking the moral high ground, if you like, to insist that we do that. And we've made commitments about imports, certain chicken and beef imports from the US that we don't like. What we can and should be doing is saying we would very much like to import meat and food produce from around the world, but we think that there are standards that should be met, and I think we can do that. We eat a lot of food.
That's great, thank you.
I certainly try.
You say you certainly do.
We've got just under 15 minutes left, and we're whizzing through time. But I just want to come back to the sort of central framing of this seminar. This idea of a call to home, that what we do overseas has to connect with people at home, particularly if we think about the election result and the way sort of the country, the demographics have changed in terms of the supporters who voted for the government at last election. So my question is, how can we connect what we do overseas with voters at home, and particularly what sort of role does civil society and faith groups and community groups and the private sector have in doing that? And perhaps Polly, I'll come to you.
Oh, I'm the lucky one. I think rights-based campaigns often trigger a sense of pride. I was thinking, after I'd failed to answer the previous question, about LGBT rights, and the UK was one of the earlier countries to legislate for equal marriage, but we know that LGBT people are oppressed around the world. We also know that religious oppression, it's, obviously we've talked about the Uyghurs, but we know also that within China, there's oppression of Christians, there's oppression of Christians within the Middle East in lots of ways. And, it's good to see the government, Tim Montgomery, not that he's a minister, has campaigned for that, for us to speak out on those issues. Because when you talk about not human rights in the abstract, but specific rights of people who we can easily remind ourselves are just like us, but who don't have the liberty and the freedom that we enjoy here, whether it's freedom of worship or freedom of sexuality, of gender. I think that helps to remind people of our common humanity, and also to focus on the areas where there is still so much to be won. And there's no case, I don't think there's any case that it doesn't matter. I think, yeah, there's a lot of solidarity there. I think it's important as well to remember, as Mavis reminded us, that people like us includes, the extraordinary diversity of the UK and our huge numbers of diaspora communities, for whom relationships with different parts of the developing world are much more complex than than me, who, my heritage is that I'm, part Scottish, part English, and part Welsh. So the connections that people have are something that we can also lean on and celebrate, because we have these incredibly diverse communities. And I think we should, it's a way of talking about our history with pride, in that there are lots of historic reasons to do with lots of our history, which is less than pleasant around our kind of colonial past, but where actually it's a wonderful thing that we have so many Caribbean people, because of historic links between the UK and the Caribbean, who live in the UK and have done so for such a long time. That's something we should celebrate and make a kind of really positive part of our narrative. We have to remember that people like us includes a lot of people all around the world.
Thank you, Polly. Mavis, can I come to you?
Sure. And I'd like to build on Polly's point around, we have a common agenda. We are all human beings. We have a common agenda. And I think we often miss a trick in our development work, because most of the communication is focused on a crisis or the negative. And what is being done and what has been achieved by British support in development assistance is more than just the crisis and, the negative stuff we read in the newspapers at times. We really need to show the positive impact. Dominic talked about ways in which countries have evolved and grown, improved infrastructure, and it's been done in partnership with these countries. Britain doesn't fix everything for every country. Britain works in partnership with countries to build infrastructure. And we are seeing progress, because, to be honest, it's only human nature to get frustrated and a tad fed up with hearing the same thing over and over and over again. So in the same way, when we have a crisis in the UK and we overcome the crisis and we learn and we improve, it's the same as in developing countries. When a crisis happens, as we saw in Ethiopia in the 1980s, Ethiopia evolved, it grew, it learned. And if you looked at the last crisis that happened in Ethiopia, it was so much lower than what we saw in the 1980s. That's a massive improvement that has been achieved between Ethiopia and its partners like Britain. Let's tell those stories. Let's help British communities see the progress and not just keep going on and on and on about the negative and the, I don't know, the negative stereotypes of starvation and lack of progress and corruption. And, you know, countries have evolved, they change the same way Great Britain evolves and changes. So let's share that changing.
Thank you, Mavis. Dominic.
Well, you know, everyone's got a role to play, whether you're a faith group, a local community centre. I think even Mavis's comments at the beginning of this session, where we talked about, you know, local schools in not the wealthiest parts of Britain, connecting with schools in certainly not the wealthiest parts of the world, and making a difference. And look, we're instantly connected. You know, I've got a friend in a refugee camp in northern Kenya, a refugee camp called Kakuma, and he's on Instagram, and I met him when I went and spent time in Kakuma refugee camp, meeting young entrepreneurs and working with actually the sports teams there and building connections with the communities. And there's this guy there called Samir Breezy. And Samir is a refugee from the Congo, and he's now living in northern Kenya in Kakuma, and he's a tailor. And I tell you, the Congolese tailors and their fashions and their prints are out of this world. And he's got an Instagram called Samir Breezy. You should all go and check it out. And Samir and I became friends in Kakuma, and we've stayed in touch ever since. Like, we talk to each other on Instagram. I promote his product to friends. This is not promotion now, by the way, but do check it out. You know, this is a young man who took his family to a refugee camp to be safe, to be secure, to not have to live in fear and persecution, and is getting back on his feet in a refugee camp in northern Kenya and trading with the world. And, you know, we're from two different parts of society. I wasn't born in a country at war. I didn't grow up with fear. I didn't have to consider about running away from home. And I didn't have to live in a refugee camp to get ahead. But now I've been able, you know, to build a friendship with this young gentleman and see how his career is prospering, and that digital instant connection. So we are connected globally. Issues do become ours as quick as they become someone else's. And the networks that are available to us have so much power. Now, they also have so much, you know, there are major risks with the likes of Twitter and Instagram and disinformation campaigns, and we're seeing more of that in the news this week. But ultimately, genuine connections are important across faiths, across backgrounds. And I think Britain is, British people are very curious. And I mean that of British people of all backgrounds. You know, Holly said she's Scottish, Welsh and English, 100% British, I'm sure, at the same time. You know, same with Mavis. We're all 100% British here. And we are curious people. We like to travel. We like to engage. That regardless of our faith or our background or the stereotypes, we are interconnected with the world. As Danny said earlier, our music travels, it's unique. And our music is created by so many different cultures, British people of different cultures, that travels internationally. And so faith has that role as well. Church halls, local mosques, you know, little villages, and your niece or nephew on Instagram who've got friends in countries that they've never heard of, chatting away. We're connected, we're engaged. We all want the world to be a better place. Let's hope with these changes, and with global Britain having freedom now to make some of these decisions, how it strengthens those relationships. that's a very powerful tool, and the younger generation cannot be forgotten in this decision, because it's their Britain just as much as it is for the leaders of this country to consider.
Thank you, Dominic. Danny, before going into politics, you were on the front line of some of these important charities working on youth crime prevention, for example. Could you talk us through how civil society and community groups can have sort of real tangible interaction with government and feed into some of these big decisions without sort of shouting from the sidelines, which also sometimes happens?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, I'm a magpie here. I'm just picking up other people's ideas from the conversation. I completely agree that it's sort of community-to-community relationships are going to bring our world together, probably more than the grand structures, even though we need, sort of architecture of global cooperation. We've seen that in this recent crisis. People's identification with global supranational institutions is weak. And I think that weak for a reason. It's that people can't identify, they can't invest the sort of guts and heart blood that they want to, that we need to invest in the institutions we belong to. So personally, I don't think we're ever going to be, and I don't want ever to be, a kind of a one world government with global systems in charge. I think that, and going back to our perennial topic, I think the Brexit vote was a rejection of that direction of travel. So we need global institutions that don't undermine the local, but what we need is strong local, and what we've been discussing, and yes, Mavis's original opening story about the connection between schools is a really powerful one. And in my experience, so I ran a charity for 10 years that works in prisons and with ex-prisoners, and every Wednesday night we'd have a kind of community night, a meal, when our members, as we call them, ex-offenders, would meet for dinner, and they'd bring friends and the team and other volunteers would all sit around. And what you had there was always a very punchy conversation. I would usually chair some debate on some topical issue, and what we'd usually end up with is a big argument about to what extent power is corrupt. And this was the eternal conversation. Everything kind of often seemed to come back to that, is that the people in charge are corrupt. And this is the great justification for any of our own criminality, is that we think that the people above us are criminals, so why shouldn't we be? And so it's a self-justifying creed among offenders that there is corruption in the world. And I would always try and challenge this by acknowledging there is corruption, but that actually we've just got a bunch of people in charge are no more wicked than the rest of us. And in fact, they're just as incompetent as the rest of us. And most of the world's problems are to do with incompetence, not conspiracy. And that we all have to take responsibility for our own behaviour in order to make the kind of senior level world better. So I guess I'm just reinforcing the point that others have made, that we need to behave well to one another, and we need to have communities that enable and engender good relationships. And without that, we can have lots of big conversations about structures, and we can design perfect global architecture. But if we don't behave well in our private lives and in our civil society, there's no foundation for a better world. And I just end with, and to echo something what Dominic's been saying, which I think applies to civil society as well. The amazing interconnectedness of business is the template that I would like to see in social action across the world. And I'd like to see a lot more of an interconnectedness among civil society globally. It goes back to my point about the UK being what I hope it should be more of a global centre for social innovation, and the place that people look to see what interesting stuff is going on around social policy. Because we are an entrepreneur, kind of global, it's not that Britain is making great stuff. We can attract and showcase and create connections between amazing social innovations from around the world because of our history and our geography and our language and our culture. So I think that's the role that we can play in the world, is to help, just as frankly we have in enabling global business relationships, to enable global civil society relationships should be a really great mission for global Britain.
Great, thank you, Danny. And I think that's a nice point to finish on as we reach the end of our time. So thank you so much to everyone who submitted a question. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. To our excellent panel of speakers, Danny, Mavis, Polly and Dominic, thank you so much. And to everyone who tuned in today, I hope you enjoyed today's virtual event. We'll be hosting more over the coming months, so please do keep an eye on our website and Twitter feed for more details. But in the meantime, thank you very much again to our viewers and to our panelists, and I hope you have a very good afternoon. Thank you.